Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Irresistible, Fall into Romance, the Irresistible Romance Book 5 Anthology, and I'll be reading from Two Hearts Truce by Tamara Ferguson. This is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue, Iraq, July 2018. Captain Christine Cameron saluted to the Major, keeping up the pretense, turning and heading back to the supply truck where Sergeant Jeffrey Frisco was waiting with Captain Jeremy Northrup, who'd been critically injured. Christine peeked into the rear of the truck. "I think I might have figured it out," she muttered grimly. "I think Major Darnell was in on setting the trap to gun down our unit." Although they'd arrested their guide, Anwar Abu, who'd come highly recommended, both men looked astonished since they'd figured he'd been working alone. Jeff cleared his throat. "What makes you think so?" "Darnell's been wearing full body armor when we were told that any kind of vest would not be necessary since we'd be traveling over mountainous terrain, especially during the final leg of our journey." Jeremy frowned. "Then the bullet would have hit the vest instead of his arm if you hadn't pulled him out of range." "Exactly," she answered. Jeff growled. "But we have no way to prove it." "We don't," Christine admitted, "but I also began thinking about how convenient that shooting was that happened." Jeremy sighed. They were able to find him using a tracker. "It makes sense," Christine agreed. "He's probably got some kind of device on him somewhere, which leads me to believe that this might not be the only surprise attack. So I've come up with a plan." "Okay, ma'am, let's hear it," Sergeant Frisco replied. Christine had been concerned about leaving Darnell alone with Abu, because if he had a sensor on him, he might try to hand it over to Abu if he knew that they would not be traveling all the way to the secret airbase, where he would have assumed the chopper delivering them to Germany would be waiting. So rather than disabusing him of that fact, Christine had told Darnell that they wouldn't be removing his bloody clothing until he boarded the chopper, before giving him a strong sedative. Jeff would be traveling along in the Jeep with Darnell and Abu, and as soon as Darnell showed signs of nodding off while they traveled, Jeff was prepared to stop their convoy momentarily while a couple of men transferred Darnell onto a stretcher and loaded him into the supply truck with Jeremy and Christine. To avert Abu's possible suspicions, Christine had suggested pretending Darnell was having complications from his gunshot wound. The first thing that Jeff had done was reposition and cuff Abu in the back of the Jeep, so he was turned away from the Major and faced the supply trucks while they traveled back along the same road on which they'd arrived. Christine had returned to the supply truck immediately after injecting Darnell with the sedative, and was with Jeremy again, finishing with tending his wounds. It was hot, dry, and arid in Iraq, and it was important to retain as much moisture in the skin as possible, so the surgeon had a better chance of saving more of Jeremy's arm. Another 15 minutes later, Jeff noticed Darnell was finally nodding off, so he had the driver stop the Jeep. Less than 5 minutes after that, Jeff had returned to the supply truck, along with 2 men who were carrying the Major on a stretcher. After finishing with covering all but Jeremy's wrist and hand with the antibiotic sheets, Christine set to work moving the supplies away from the entire rear of the truck, so that the Major's stretcher could be slid in beside Jeremy's. As the men loaded Major Darnell into the truck, Jeff brought out a map, showing it to Christine when she stepped out from the truck. "We're about here," he said, pointing. "We've made good time," she murmured. "I think we'll be safe to make that SOS call in about 25 minutes. We need to be about here," she said, laying her finger further north on the map. "Where can the chopper land if you're able to get a hold of your team?" She grimaced. "We'd better be able to reach them, otherwise we'd have to radio in for help from Ain al-Assad, and we'd lose a lot more time. We can't take any chances, though," Christine sighed. "I remembered an old abandoned airbase which was used a few years ago by our pilots, who aided with reclaiming Kobani. My team has used the place as a coordinated rendezvous point more than once, and with the directions I've provided, we'll be driving along the nearest road." "How's the captain doing?" Jeff asked softly. "Pretty good. I wish I could give him more ketamine for the pain, but he's finding it hard enough to stay awake as it is. Sergeant Ryder is taking over the lead in the Jeep so I can help you with the Major. I'm going to give the sergeant these directions, and then I should be back by the time the men have finished situating the Major in the back of the truck. I'm going to grab Major Darnell's belongings while I'm at it. He had everything packed inside the Jeep when we left the airbase this morning." "Good. We'd better start searching him right away. If we're being tracked, we need to get rid of the device as soon as possible." "If we do discover any kind of device, I have an idea about what we can do with it," Jeff answered. "I'll explain after we're moving again." Christine had already begun searching the Major by the time Jeff returned to the truck. "I'm not finding anything in his shirt," she said, glancing at the sergeant and frowning. "I'm running my fingers around all the seams and hems." Check out the buttons, too, Jeremy instructed, unhooking the Major's thick protective vest of armor covering his chest. I'll help you get that off, Christine murmured. I should probably put that injured arm of his in a sling for transportation so it doesn't put too much pressure on his shoulder. After situating the Major and constructing an inventive sling for his shoulder, Christine took a moment to check Jeremy's pulse since he was looking paler. The pain is starting to get to me is all, he murmured. I'll be fine. You'd better be, she growled before moving back beside the Major. Jeff grimaced, pulling off one of the Major's boots. Let's see what's in his pockets first. There was nothing in the front pants pockets, but I was waiting for you to help me remove them before checking him back. All right, let me get off the other boot, and then I can lift him while you tug off the pants. Switching positions, Christine did as he suggested, but Jeff had to snort as she pulled off the Major's uniform pants. Is something wrong? She asked, looking at the sergeant first and then at the Major before rolling her eyes upward. Commando, huh? That takes a lot of nerve. She shook her head, looking disgusted. The Major had been making a play for Christine when he'd been shot, and Jeff realized that he'd apparently expected her acquiescence once he'd gotten her alone. See if he has shorts or underwear in his bag, will you, Sergeant? I'd be happy to, Jeff snorted again before opening the Major's duffel bag and giving her a side glance as he pulled out a pair of athletic shorts from inside. It looked like getting shot was the best thing that could have happened. Vest or not, he was lucky that I wasn't the one who shot him since I had my rifle in my hands. I'd have loved seeing that, Jeremy murmured. Christine wrinkled her nose, digging through the Major's pockets as Jeff slipped the shorts on the Major. Nothing but a wallet and his credentials. I thought he might be carrying a phone, but that would probably be too obvious. Jeff murmured, and since they were able to locate you near the river, I doubt if there's anything to look for in his belongings. Christine continued examining the Major's pants, even inspecting the belt. I don't think there's anything here. A few minutes later, Jeff was studying the Major's boots when he looked at Christine in disbelief. I guess I wasn't really ready to accept the fact that he was in on it, but I think I found something here. Christine watched as Jeff pulled out the knife hanging from his belt, slipping the tip into an indentation running alongside the length of the sole of one of the Major's boots. Half the sole popped off from the boot, exposing a cavity containing what was obviously a technologically advanced tracking device. Geez, Captain, you sure have good instincts, Jeff muttered. That device looks like one I've seen that had unlimited range. What were you going to suggest we do with it besides just destroying it? Well, I was thinking, Jeff answered. What's going to happen to Abu? We have no control over his actions. We're going to hand him right back to the Iraqis. Looking at how unwanted the U.S. military seems to be in this country lately, what are they going to do to Abu if we hand him over? I can see it now, Jeremy said faintly. They wouldn't label our being attacked as anything more than a coincidence. And for all we know, someone from their military might have been in on it, too. Jeff replied, We'll just drop Abu off along with the tracker, where he'd have to do a considerable amount of walking to reach civilization, so we'll be able to throw him off along with any others who might be trying to sabotage our mission. All right. The sooner we get rid of Abu, the better, Christine admitted, glancing at Jeff. Let's have 2 of your most trusted men drive Abu off course in a jeep and drop him further east. Say, near that settlement we drove by, which was a couple of hours away from Ain al-Assad. We're about ready to head north, so it probably wouldn't be difficult for our men to catch up after Abu's released. Jeff pursed his lips. I hope our fuel holds out. Christine agreed. We have some contract connections for our choppers. I can check with my team when I contact them to see if there's anyone nearby willing to supply fuel if we need it. Jeremy was still managing to be alert for their conversation. There's extra fuel for the jeep stored inside one of the other supply trucks. Since these supply trucks have double tanks, I would see if we've switched over to the second tanks yet or not, because if we haven't, we should be fine. We should reach that intersection in about 15 minutes, Jeff observed. I told Sergeant Ryder we'd be stopping momentarily. I think we're good to go, Christine answered. All that's left for me to do medically is to wrap the captain's lower arm and hand. Let me try and make the call to my team before we send Abu off in the jeep towards Ain al-Assad. We might have to return there if one of the choppers in my rescue team isn't available. Shortly thereafter, the supply truck slowed down when they'd obviously reached the intersection. Jeff had pulled out the tracking device from the Major's boot before snapping the sole back together. Christine dropped the Major's clothes and boots in a plastic bag, stuffing it into his duffel before slipping his wallet into the side pocket. As Jeff stepped out from the truck carrying the tracker in his pocket, Christine pulled out her personal defense-grade security phone she used for classified communications, deciding it was time to try and make the call to her team. Jeff glanced at the major. The captain sedated him pretty heavily, but he still might be snapping out of it soon. Christine stepped out of the truck where Jeff stood waiting, quickly plugging in the code and her number. "Schuyler, Team 2 here," a gruff voice answered. "Captain McKay?" "Yes, Lieutenant Schuyler, but it's on the record as Cameron now instead of McKay since I'm no longer married." Jeff turned, staring at her sharply, wondering why she hadn't mentioned it to Jeremy since they seemed to be so deeply attuned to one another. "Gotcha, ma'am. Sorry to hear that." "Well, I'm not," she snorted. "We need your help. Is there a chopper available for medical transport to Germany from here to Iraq?" "As a matter of fact, there is, ma'am. Mine. They've us working out of that abandoned air base which was used by our bombers a few years back." Christine went silent momentarily. "Talk about coincidence. We're headed your way. I'd say we're about 20 minutes out. Can you be ready? We have 2 patients. One's a gunshot victim, just a scrape to the shoulder. It's the other patient I'm most concerned about. Captain Jeremy Northrop has a series of first and second-degree burns inflicted by a nearby detonation of an improvised explosive device, and he's probably going to need an amputation of his hand and most of his lower arm. Also, I'm worried about concussion." "No problem. We'll be ready for you, ma'am. I'll load up the supplies we'll need and rev up the chopper, and we'll be seeing you shortly. Be sure to contact us if you run into any delays." "We're good to go," Christine murmured to Sergeant Fresco after she disconnected the phone. "Hide that tracker somewhere on a boot or in his bag, and they can be on their way." "Yes, ma'am," the sergeant answered briskly, giving her a salute. 20 minutes later, Jeff directed to the driver to follow a dirt road with the Jeep, pulling into a wide-open hangar, but leaving plenty of room for the supply truck drivers to follow them inside. Jeff stepped out the Jeep and rushed over to assisting Christine while loading Jeremy into the chopper ahead of the major. After having a couple of the men grab Jeremy's duffel and an additional bag loaded with some of his equipment and belongings, Jeff walked along beside Christine. Jeremy looked down at himself as he was carried away on the stretcher wearing only his shorts, with Christine walking closely beside him. "Don't I get to be covered up? I kind of feel naked here." "Trust me," Christine murmured. "Once the painkillers wear off completely, the last thing you'll want is to have anything covering your skin." Christine's eyes suddenly roved over him completely before she winked. "Besides, I wouldn't want all the nurses at the hospital to miss out on getting a glimpse of that sexy muscular body of yours. You'll have them eating out of your hand, and that way I'll be certain they're taking care of you." Jeremy blinked while Jeff snorted, smiling widely. She was definitely as crazy about Jeremy as Jeremy was about her. Jeremy looked taken aback by the fact that Christine was flirting with him, and he looked at her uncertainly as she reached for his hand, squeezing it as his men stood ready and waiting, preparing to load him into the chopper. "Christine?" "Yes?" she asked loudly over the roar of the chopper blades as they slid the stretcher into the chopper's floor. "How bad am I going to look? Will I be disfigured? It feels like my neck and my chin are on fire." Stepping inside and kneeling beside him, she laid her hand over the uninjured side of his face, staring deeply into his eyes. She suddenly smiled, answering softly, "Jeremy, you're going to look great wearing a beard." Apparently that was all Jeremy needed to hear, and when she surprised him again by gently kissing his forehead, he closed his eyes. Jeff cleared his throat before exiting the chopper, and Jeremy opened his eyes. "Good luck, sir. All of us are rooting for you." "I'm planning on recommending you for command of both units, Jeff. I just wanted you to know." "Thank you, Captain, but it still won't be the same without you," Jeff answered, stepping out from inside the chopper. "I was going to suggest the same thing," Christine admitted, squeezing Jeremy's hand one last time. "The next time I see you, I expect to see you happy and healthy." "I'll do my best," Jeremy answered. "You'll see some serious rehab time, but don't get discouraged." Jeremy nodded his acceptance. Christine exited the chopper as the major was loaded inside. Jeff sighed as the chopper took flight. "I suppose we'd better be on our way, Captain?" "Let's take a minute to regroup and check our maps," she answered distractedly. 10 minutes later, they were on their way back down the dirt road when Jeff noticed some unusual activity ahead along the side of the road in the ditch. He glanced at the captain, who was sitting beside him. She'd apparently noticed too because she was readying her rifle. "Slow it down and warn the others to ready their weapons, Sergeant," she murmured softly, sounding deadly. "Join me as soon as you're done." Jeff had the driver slow down so he could jump off the Jeep and give some quick instructions to the other members of the unit who were back inside the trucks. As they slowed, the troops lined each side of the road as they approached the intersection with the main road. Suddenly, shots sounded out, and both Jeff and Christine were able to contain the first 2 men who strangely appeared to be targeting them. Another few insurgents appeared from along the road, but seemed to have little artillery available for attack, so they were taken care of promptly by other members of the unit. They pulled their convoy to a halt, watching and waiting as Christine set a team of a half-dozen men and women ahead to secure the road. "We'd better send someone back to the hangar and give them a warning," Jeff murmured another 15 minutes later when they were given the all-clear. "Did you get the feeling that you and I were specifically being targeted?" "I did," Jeff agreed. "How did they find us? We took every precaution." Christine heaved a sigh. "I'm thinking that Darnell was probably fitted with more than one tracking device." Christine's eyes were filled with concern as she gave the order for them to move on. And Jeff was suddenly filled with dread about the future. How and why would they have been targeted?